Family spirit. On a hill in the Yamanote area, there is a busy intersection where streetcars cross paths. A narrow road branches off from this intersection, leading down a slope toward the valley of the downtown area. Halfway down the slope, across from the precincts of the Hachiman Shrine, there is a famous dojo, loche, restaurant. The restaurant has a well-polished 1,000-bar latticework, with an entrance in the middle and an old curtain, Nurian, hanging over it. The Nurian has the word life, written in white, in the distinctive style of the family's calligraphy. Loach, catfish, soft-shelled turtle, blowfish, and, in summer, whale jerky, these kinds of foods were believed to nourish the body. The founder of the restaurant, with what was considered at the time a brilliant idea, named the restaurant Life. At the time, the name was novel, but over the decades, it became quite ordinary, losing its power to attract attention. However, due to the restaurant's unique cooking style and affordable prices, it always had customers. About 4 or 5 years ago, the word life began to evoke a sense of unease, appealing to notions of adventure stemming from the void, or a persistent search for the dawn of a new era. In this romantic period, the faded characters on the Nurian, long darkened by soot, unexpectedly began to resonate with the young men in the area, giving them a sort of impromptu shock. When they arrived at the entrance, they would gaze at the Nurian and say with a melancholic, youthful air, "I'm exhausted. Shall we eat a bit of life?" Their companions, with a slightly more casual tone, would reply, "Just don't let it eat you back." And then, patting each other on the shoulder, they would crowd into the restaurant. The dining area was one large room. Long, narrow planks were laid across the cool, woven straw mats in a grid-like pattern, serving as dining tables. Customers would sit on the mats or perch on stools on the dirt floor, enjoying food and drink. Most of the food they consumed was served in pots or bowls. The place was sooty from steam and smoke. Judging from how high the cleaning rags could reach, only the lower half of the wooden walls, glowing a reddish-brown like copper, was cleaned. From halfway up to the ceiling, the walls were pitch black, resembling the inside of a stove. A bare chandelier, hanging even in daylight, illuminated the room with a brilliant, bleaching light. The stark brightness didn't just make the room feel like a cave, it also transformed the food before the diners. When the light struck a fishbone caught between a customer's chopsticks, it appeared like a branch of white coral, and when it hit the pile of green onions on the plates, they glistened like gemstones. The entire scene resembled a grotesque feast of hungry spirits. One reason for this impression might have been the way the customers ate. There was something furtive about the way they bit into the food, as if they were gnawing on a secret. On one of the wooden walls, there was a medium-sized window with a shelf beneath it. The dishes ordered by the customers were passed from the kitchen to this shelf, and the waitresses brought them to the tables. When collecting payments, the bills were also placed here. For a long time, the white face of the elderly mother of the restaurant's proprietress could be seen inside the window, watching over things. Now, it was her daughter, Kumeko, with her wheat-colored complexion, who monitored the waitress's service and kept an eye on the customers. Occasionally, she would peek out of the window, and when she did, the students in the restaurant would let out strange noises. Kumeko, smiling wryly, would tell the waitresses, "Give them plenty of condiments to keep them quiet." When a waitress, suppressing her laughter, brought an exaggeratedly large heap of chopped green onions to the students' table, they would cheer triumphantly. For them, a pile of onions was proof that they had made an impact on Kumeko. Kumeko had returned to the shop about 7 or 8 months ago, taking her sick mother's place and starting to sit behind the counter. Ever since she was attending girls' school, she had hated this cave-like house with a deep aversion. She couldn't stand the idea of running a shop that catered to the dietary needs of the aged and the weak, who consumed food as if it were a form of therapy. Why do people fear aging so intensely? If you're weak, just stay weak, it's fine. There's nothing more vulgar than flaunting vitality, greasy and gleaming with excess. Kumeko was the kind of girl who would get a headache even from the scent of fresh shea tree leaves in early summer. She loved the moon and the evening sky seen through the trees more than the leaves themselves. Maybe it was because, deep down, she had grown tired of her own youthful abundance. In this shop's tradition, men were in charge of purchasing and cooking, while wives or daughters managed the counter. And since she was an only daughter, she knew that eventually she'd have to marry some ordinary man and spend her life as the guardian of this den of gluttony. Her mother had faithfully carried out this duty, and in doing so, had become so worn down, to the point where her face, devoid of any character, was as fragile as a no-mask, pale and shadowed in gray. The thought that she too would end up like that sent shivers down Kumeko's spine. After finishing girls' school, Kumeko took the opportunity to leave home, almost like running away, and set off on a career as a working woman. During those 3 years, she never spoke about what she did or how she lived. She kept in touch with her family by sending the occasional postcard from her apartment. The way she remembered it, for those 3 years, she flitted around her glamorous workplace like a butterfly, brushing against her male friends as lightly as ants greet each other by touching feelers. That was all there was to it. It felt both like a dream and a tiresome repetition of the same thing over and over again. When her mother became bedridden with illness and Kumeko was summoned back home by her relatives, she returned, seemingly unchanged, apart from having grown older. Her mother asked, "What have you been doing all this time?" Kumeko simply smiled, "Iya-hey," with a carefree grin. There was a breezy, untouchable quality in that response that prevented further probing. Her mother wasn't the type to press for answers either. "Starting tomorrow, I'll need you to take over the shop," her mother said, to which Kumeko replied with the same light-hearted, "Iya-hey." Besides, their family had never been the kind to have heartfelt conversations or serious discussions. They would always end up feeling embarrassed around each other. With a sense of resignation, Kumeko began managing the shop's counter, this time not minding the task as much as she used to. It was a day close to the end of the year. The wind blew the sand off the slope, and the wooden clogs hit the frozen, dry earth mercilessly. The sound echoed at the roots of her hair, creating a cold evening. From the intersection at the top of the slope, the creaking of the tram mixed with the rustling of the trees in the grounds of the nearby Hachiman shrine, as if it were being thrown at her ears. It also sounded as if a blind person was murmuring from a distance. If she stepped out onto the slope and looked down, she imagined the lights of the downtown area flickering like bonfires on a winter sea. After a customer had left, the room was thick with the smell of boiled food and tobacco smoke, enveloping the chandelier. The waitress and the delivery man gathered the remaining embers of the hibachi into the stone hearth, and were warming themselves. Kumeko found it unpleasant to feel a heaviness in her heart on such an evening, so she tried to lighten her mood by flipping through the pages of fashion magazines and movie advertisements. There was still over an hour until the store closed at 10 o'clock, and she thought not many customers would come. Just as she was considering closing the shop, a younger delivery man returned looking cold. "Miss, if you take the alley behind, Tokunaga has placed another order, 1 serving of rice with eel soup." "What should we do?" The waitress, who had been waiting for something to happen out of boredom, looked up. "How shameless. He's racked up over 100 yen in debts without paying a single sen, and now." She glanced at the window, wondering how the cashier would respond to this. "This is troublesome. But since my mother's time, I've decided to lend to him without question, so let's just let him have it today." Then, the older delivery man, who had been warming himself by the hearth, raised his head and said, "That's not right, miss. It's the end of the year, and we should settle things around here. Otherwise, it'll be a never-ending cycle into next year." The older delivery man was a leader among the shop's staff, and his opinion had to be taken seriously. So, Kumeko agreed, saying, "Well then, let's do that." A bowl of boiled udon with fox nanban was served from the kitchen and distributed to the staff for a late-night meal. Kumeko received one of these bowls, glowing on the hot steam. As she was finishing her late-night meal, the person in charge of the fire patrol came around, and when the clapper echoed against the thin glass shoji door outside, the sign indicated that even before the designated time, the front door should be lowered. At that moment, the sound of Zori's sandals approached quietly, and the front shoji door opened gently. The face of the old man Tokunaga, with his beard, peered in. "Good evening, it's quite cold, isn't it?" The staff pretended not to notice. The old man glanced at everyone's demeanor, but with a worried and sly voice, he asked, About the order, was the udon soup with rice not ready yet?" The delivery boy who had taken the order began to say with a somewhat awkward expression, "I'm sorry, but it's already past closing time." Before he could finish, the older delivery boy shot him a stern look and gestured for him to be quiet. "Just tell him the honest truth." The younger delivery boy explained that due to the accumulated debt, which had exceeded 100 yen, they needed at least a small payment at this time to avoid issues with the year-end accounts. Besides, it's different from before since the lady is in charge now. The old man rubbed his hands nervously and tilted his head, saying, "Oh, is that how it is?" Then he added, "In any case, it's terribly cold. I'd like to have one, please." And with that, he creaked the front shoji door and came inside. The young girl did not offer a cushion, so the old man sat alone in the cold, wide space of the bamboo tatami, looking lonely and like a sinner awaiting judgment. Though bundled up, his large physique did not seem very robust. He had a habit of placing his left hand into his bosom, pressing against his ribs. His hair was nearly pure white and slicked back, and he had distinguished facial features that seemed almost too well defined, suggesting a certain misfortune. In contrast to his scholar-like face, he wore a tattered obi with a front flap, and the hem of his sitting kimono revealed pale yellow undergarments. Even his black cotton tabi felt out of place. At first, the old man frequently spoke to the window where the young girl was and to the shop employees about the recession, lamenting the lack of demand for his profession as a goldsmith, and he stammered out excuses for not being able to pay his debts. However, as he started to emphasize his situation, he shifted to discussing the rarity of his work, and he suddenly grew haughty and passionate. The author presents this old man as a representation of a mood that could be seen as either triumphant or lamenting, especially on this particular night. He said, "The goldsmithing I do is different from other types, it's called katagiri bori. Generally, goldsmithing is a craft of cutting gold with gold, and it's not an easy art. It requires spirit. You can't go on without eating even a single dojo loach every day." The old man had the common tendency found in aged craftsmen to forget his purpose for speaking, becoming egotistical and delivering a monologue no matter the situation. When he began to explain more about his katagiri bori, he proudly mentioned it as a technique from the famous craftsmen of the Jinroku era, like Yokoi Asoman, stating that in terms of kendo, it's like a one-point match. He held a chisel in his left hand and a hammer in his right. He steadied his body, took a deep breath through his nose, and concentrated his strength in his lower abdomen. Though it was merely a mimic demonstration, it was nonetheless strikingly precise. There was a sense of natural principle in his form, flexible yet unbreakable, evoking a feeling of resilience. Both the delivery boy and the young girl felt a tightening presence from the old man, causing them to draw closer to the hearth. The old man momentarily broke that solemn posture and chuckled, "He. If it were ordinary engraving, I could carve it like this, or like this, with just a little hand skill," the old man said. This time, he seemed almost like a storyteller, expertly exaggerating the gracefulness and lightness of handling the chisel and hammer through the way he twisted his wrists and bent his back. Both the delivery man and the young girl chuckled. But when it comes to katagiri bori, one cut engraving. The old man returned to his previous dignified posture. Opening his eyes slowly, which had been closed, his gaze, sharp as a blue lotus flower, was quietly cast at an angle. He held his left hand perfectly still in one place while extending his right arm fully from the shoulder. Moving only from the shoulder, he drew a large arc from above, and his hammer struck down on the chisel with great force. Kumeko, peering through the window, briefly recalled a youthful figure of a Greek sculpture she had seen in school, depicting a young man throwing a discus, His right arm stretched to the utmost limit of human physical capability. The beautiful, taut arm seemed to echo in her mind. The force with which the old man struck was as if the hatred of destruction and the joy of creation were screaming in unison. The speed of his movement was of such an otherworldly nature that it was hard to discern whether it belonged to a devil or a benevolent deity. The arcs traced by the old man's hammer, rising and falling like celestial trajectories that instilled a sense of infinity in the viewer, halted abruptly at a precise distance just before reaching the chisel's hand. It was as if some kind of break existed there, a kind of discipline of the craft, perhaps. The old man repeated this several times before relaxing his body. "Everyone, did you understand?" he asked. "That's why you must eat something like loach, otherwise, I can't go on." In fact, this one sequence of the old man's manner is something that happens every time. Once it begins, the people in the store temporarily forget that they are inside, and that they are in the Yamanote area of Tokyo, as they become captivated by the pleasant tension and the unrestrained feeling of normalcy. They look at the old man's face again. However, since the old man's sincere story ultimately comes down to the subject of loaches, they all burst into laughter. Feeling a bit awkward, the old man wraps up his discomfort and says, "Now, as for the use of this chisel's sharp edge, there are both yin and yang," regaining his pride as a craftsman. The discussion then shifts to how the peony possesses its enchanting life and the magnificent vitality of the Chinese lion is carved out with the technique of these two types of chiseling. The old man speaks about the process of bringing living things to life on a hard sheet of metal through this craft, increasing his gestures and sipping on the sweetness of the droplets with a glazed look in his eyes. This was a pleasure indulged in only by the craftsman himself, which bored the staff. After such talk, the staff thought it was time to wrap things up, so they said, "Well then, just for tonight, we'll deliver. Go home and wait." They then sent the old man off and closed the front door. One night, it was a windy evening. The night watchman's clapper had passed, and the staff had closed the front door and set off for the bath. As if having seen them off, the old man quietly opened the low entrance door and came in. He sat facing the window where the girl was. In the wide room, time flowed lazily in the late hours with the old man facing just one window. Tonight, the old man had a determined, forlorn expression. "From a young age, I have had a fondness for loaches. This body of mine requires food that can always supplement its work, otherwise, my craft cannot continue. Moreover, after living in this dilapidated back alley for over 20 years, no matter how lonely or difficult life as a widower may be, that little fish, with its tail fin like willow leaves, has strangely become more than just food to me." The old man began to speak in a rambling manner, recounting various things without regard for order. "Even when I am filled with jealousy toward others, scorned, and my heart rages like a demon king, if I put that small fish in my mouth and crunch it slowly from the head with my front teeth, my resentment shifts there, and gentle tears begin to well up from nowhere. I feel pity for the small fish being eaten, and I feel sorry for myself as well. Everyone is endearing in their way. That's all there is to it. I don't particularly desire a wife. However, I do long for something fragile. When I want something delicate, seeing that small fish seems to quell my aching heart." The old man finally took out a towel handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his nose. "It may be presumptuous to say this in front of you, a young woman," he prefaced, "but the lady here understood things well. Previously, when I was troubled by my unpaid bills and nervously came at night like this to make excuses, the lady, leaning her chin on her hand at the counter where you are now, peeked slightly toward the window and said, 'Tokunaga-san, if you want eels, I can give you as many as you want. Don't worry at all. Instead, when you create something you're truly dedicated to, you can use it to settle your account, or you can take the payment from me. That's all right.' Really, that's all right," she repeated. The old man wiped his nose again. The lady was still young then. She was soon to be married, just about your age. Unfortunately, her husband was a libertine, known for wandering around Yotsuya and Akasaka. The lady quietly endured this and never moved an inch from the counter. Occasionally, through the window, one could see her in a state of unbearable longing, wishing to cling to someone. That's only natural. After all, humans are flesh and blood. It's not easy to turn into a cold stone. Tokunaga was young at that time, too. He couldn't bear to watch the young lady become buried alive. To be honest, there were times he thought of forcibly taking her outside through the window. On the other hand, he often thought about how he could entangle himself with a woman who seemed like a half-mummified corpse. But whenever he looked closely at the lady's face, he lost all strength. Her face seemed to say, "If I were to make a mistake, the regrets would forever be imposed on this household, and if, moreover, there were no one in the world to comfort me, I would crumble to ashes immediately. At the very least, I want to impart the breath of life and the power of revival through my art to the shopkeeper, who is gradually turning into a fossil." I shook my body to work the chisel and hammer. There is nothing quite like the technique of katakiri bori. While struggling to comfort the shopkeeper, Tokunaga inadvertently honed the skills he inherited from the renowned Meiji artisan Kano Natsuo. However, it is not easy to produce a work that truly embodies life. Tokunaga dedicated 1 out of 100 creations to the shopkeeper, selling the next 7 or 8 to sustain his living. The rest, he found unsatisfactory, and he melted down all the half-finished materials. The shopkeeper would insert the hairpin I gifted her into her hair or take it out to admire it. At that moment, it looked alive, he said. Yet, Tokunaga remained an eternally hidden master craftsman. Although that was inevitable, time is indeed cruel. At first, I carved a large silver hairpin with a cherry blossom and willow design that could be worn with a Takashimata hairstyle. Then I started carving summer chrysanthemums and cuckoo flowers around a round bun pin, and eventually, I made fine ear picks with miscanthus and amaname flowers in hairline carvings. In the end, the last piece I carved for her was an old-fashioned hairpin with a single call of a plover on the neck, made 2 or 3 years ago. I no longer have the drive to carve at all. With that, Tokunaga completely slumped. To be honest, I have no intention of paying my debts anymore. My body has weakened. I've lost the vigor to work. The shopkeeper probably no longer needs hairpins after all these years, and all I desire is a bowl of rice and a serving of the doju, loach, soup that I've become accustomed to eating as a late-night meal. If I don't eat this, I can't survive a winter night. By morning, my body will be frozen and numb. We metalworkers live one day at a time. We don't think about tomorrow. If you are the daughter of the shopkeeper, I humbly request 5 or 6 of those thin little fish tonight as well. I would hate to die on such a frostbitten night. For just this one night, I want to take the life of those small fish and sink them into the marrow of my bones to survive. As Tokunaga pleaded, his expression resembled that of an Arab tribesman praying toward the setting sun, his face turned upward, squatting like a komainu, guardian dog, reciting his lament like a spell. Kumeko stood up from the counter, feeling as if she were intoxicated by something strange, and staggered toward the kitchen. The cook had already left, and there was no one around. The only sound was the drip of water falling into the live fish tank. Looking around under a single twisted electric light, Kumeko noticed a large bowl with a lid on it. When she removed the lid, she saw that the eels were soaking in sake for tomorrow's preparation. Some of them were still lifting their heads above the surface of the liquid, swaying slightly. The little fish that she usually found repulsive now appeared friendly. Kumeko rolled up her wheat-colored arms and began to move 1 or 2 into the pot. The fish wriggled slightly in her grasp, and then that trembling communicated a strange significance to her heart in an instant, the call of life. Kumeko poured dashi broth and miso soup into the pot, adding a handful of burdock root. She stirred it over the gas stove. The small fish floated belly up in the hot, ready soup, which she served in a red lacquered bowl. She placed a pinch of sancho pepper on the lid's handle and offered it through the window along with the rice container. "The rice might be a little cold," she said. The old man received it joyfully, without any concern for appearances, flicking the soles of his corduroy socks as he took it. carefully placing it inside a delivery container he borrowed. He opened the sliding door and disappeared like a thief. After being diagnosed with terminal cancer, the long-sick mother suddenly became cheerful. She said she had finally gained the freedom to do as she pleased. In the early spring sunshine, she got out of bed, eating whatever she desired, and spoke to Kumeko in a rare, heartfelt tone for a mother. It's strange, isn't it? The women in this family have always been neglected by their husbands. My mother was, and so was my grandmother. It's nothing to be ashamed of. However, if you endure patiently and stick it out at the shop, somehow you can keep the Nurian shop curtain up. And oddly enough, someone will come along to comfort you and infuse your life with meaning. Your mother had that, and your grandmother too. So, I'll tell you this, if anything like that ever happens to you, don't be discouraged. I'm telling you now. As she neared death, she complained that her face was dirty and had Kumeko apply a thin layer of white powder. Then she had her bring a box for koto strings from the cupboard. This is the only thing I truly received, she said, pressing the box to her cheek and gently shaking it, reminiscing fondly. Inside were many golden and silver hairpins that Tokunaga had carved with care. Hearing their sound, the mother let out a chuckle, ho ho ho, in a voice reminiscent of innocence. The mixture of strong courage to endure her fate and the lonely, pious hope for salvation intertwined in Kumeko's heart morning and evening. When this tension became overwhelming, she would shake it off like a dog, freeing her feelings with a touch of emotional craftiness, while drifting into thoughts of youth. Sometimes, she would be drawn out by the regular students, whistling the Kimigyo march as they walked up the hill together. A low mist hung over the city beyond the valley. There, while sucking on the drops given to her by the students, Kumeko pondered whimsically about which of these young men might become the wayward husband who would trouble her and who might be the earnest savior. But after a while, she would return to the shop alone, saying, "The shop is busy," and sit by the window. Old Tokunaga, growing thinner and frailer, came every night desperately begging for his bowl of dojo, loach, soup.